The Hellenistic World. The history of Greece took many curious turns after the 5th century, but the most sensational of them is how Greek civilization infused and gave direction to the imperial dreams of a kingdom which some said was not Greek at all, Macedon. In the second half of the 4th century BC, this state, based in northern Greece, created an empire bigger than any yet seen, the legatee of both Persia and all the city-states. It organized the world we call Hellenistic because of the preponderance and uniting force within it of a culture, Greek in inspiration and language. The Macedonians were the ones who brought Greek culture to the world through the amazing conquests by their 4th century emperor, Alexander. The story begins with the decline of Persian power. Persian recovery in alliance with Sparta had masked important internal weaknesses. One of them is commemorated by a famous book, the Anabasis of Xenophon, the story of the long march of an army of Greek mercenaries back up the Tigris and across the mountains to the Black Sea after an unsuccessful attempt on the Persian throne by a brother of the king. This was only a minor and subsidiary episode in the important story of Persian decline, an offshoot of one particular crisis of internal division. Throughout the 4th century that empire's troubles continued, with province after province, among them Egypt, which won its independence as early as 404 BC and held it for 60 years, slipping out of its control. A major revolt by the Western satraps took a long time to master, and though in the end imperial rule was restored, the cost had been great. When it was at last reimposed, Persian rule was often weak. One ruler tempted by the possibilities of this decline was Philip II of Macedon, a not very highly regarded northern kingdom whose power rested on a warrior aristocracy. It was a rough, tough society, its rulers still somewhat like the warlords of Homeric times, their power resting more on personal ascendancy than institutions. Whether this was a state which was a part of the world of the Hellenes was disputed. Some Greeks thought Macedonians barbarians. On the other hand, their kings claimed descent from Greek houses, one going back to Heracles, and their claim was generally recognized. Philip himself sought status, he wanted Macedon to be thought of as Greek. When he became regent of Macedon in 359 BC, he began a steady acquisition of territory at the expense of other Greek states. His ultimate argument was an army which became by the end of his reign the best trained and organized in Greece. The Macedonian military tradition had emphasized heavy armored cavalry, and this continued to be a major arm. Philip added to this tradition the benefit of lessons about infantry he had drawn while a hostage at Thebes in his youth. From hoplite tactics he evolved a new weapon, the 16-deep phalanx of pikemen. The men in its ranks carried pikes twice as long as a hoplite spear, and they operated in a more open formation, pike shafts from the second and third ranks running between men in the front to present a much denser array of weapons for the charge. Another advantage of the Macedonians was a grasp of siege warfare techniques not shown by other Greek armies. They had catapults which made it possible to force a besieged town's defenders to take cover while battering rams and mobile towers were brought into play. Such things had previously been seen only in the armies of Assyria and their Asian successors. Finally, Philip ruled a fairly wealthy state, its riches much increased once he had acquired the gold mines of Mount Pangaeum, though he spent so much that he left huge debts. He used his power first to ensure the effective unification of Macedon itself. Within a few years the infant for whom he was regent was deposed and Philip was elected king. Then he began to look to the south and northeast. In these areas expansion sooner or later meant encroachment upon the interests and position of Athens. Her allies in Rhodes, Kos, Chios and Byzantium placed themselves under Macedonian patronage. Another, Phocis, was crushed in a war in which Athens had egged her on but failed to give effective support. Although Demosthenes, the last great agitator of Athenian democracy, made himself a place in history, still recalled by the word Philippic, by warning his countrymen of the dangers they faced, he could not save them. When the war between Athens and Macedon, 355 to 346 BC, at last ended, Philip had won not only Thessaly, but had established himself in central Greece and controlled the pass of Thermopylae. His situation favored designs on Thrace, and this implied a return of Greek interest towards Persia. One Athenian writer advocated a Hellenic crusade to exploit Persia's weakness, in opposition to Demosthenes, who continued to denounce the Macedonian barbarian, and once more plans were made to liberate the Asian cities, a notion attractive enough to bear fruit in a reluctant League of Corinth formed by the major Greek states other than Sparta in 337 BC. Philip was its president and general, and it was somewhat reminiscent of the Delian League. The apparent independence of its members was a sham, for they were Macedonian satellites. Though the culmination of Philip's work and reign, he was assassinated the following year. It had only come into being after Macedon had defeated the Athenians and the Bands again in 338 BC. The terms of peace imposed by Philip were not harsh, but the League had to agree to go to war with Persia under Macedonian leadership. There was one more kick of Greek independence after Philip's death, but his son and successor Alexander crushed the Greek rebels as he did others in other parts of his kingdom. Thebes was then razed to the ground and its population enslaved, 335 BC. This was the real end of 4 centuries of Greek history. During this period, civilization had been created and sheltered by the city-state, one of the most successful political forms the world has ever known. Now, not for the first time, nor the last, the future seemed to belong to the bigger battalions, the bigger organizations. Mainland Greece was from this time a political backwater under Macedonian governors and garrisons. Like his father, Alexander sought to conciliate the Greeks by giving them a large measure of internal self-government in return for adherence to his foreign policy. This was always to leave some Greeks, notably the Athenian Democrats, unreconciled. Alexander, who we know as the Great, was born in 356 BC. Though his father wanted to introduce him to the best in Greek philosophy and science, as a very young man Alexander preferred parties to seminars. He also showed a liking for rampant violence. One historian has referred to him as a drunken juvenile thug. But he also dreamt of emulating his father's great conquests. When Alexander became king in 336, he wanted to set out to defeat the Persians and conquer the world. Alexander's reign began with difficulties with the Greeks, but once they were surmounted, he could turn his attention to Persia. In 334 BC he crossed to Asia at the head of an army of which a quarter was drawn from Greece. There was more than idealism in this. Aggressive war might also be prudent, for the fine army left by Philip had to be paid if it was not to present a threat to a new king, and conquest would provide the money. He was 22 years old, and before him lay a short career of conquest so brilliant that it would leave his name a myth down the ages and provide a setting for the widest expansion of Greek culture. He drew the city-states into a still wider world. The story is simple to summarize. Legend says that after crossing to Asia Minor he cut the Gordian knot. He then defeated the Persians at the Battle of Issus. This was followed by a campaign which swept south through Syria, destroying Tyre on the way, and eventually into Egypt, where Alexander founded the city still bearing his name. In every battle he was his own best soldier, and he was wounded several times in the melee. He pushed into the desert, interrogated the oracle at Siwa, and then went back into Asia to inflict a second and decisive defeat on Darius III in 331 BC. At Gaugamela, Persepolis was sacked and burnt, and Alexander proclaimed successor to the Persian throne. Darius was murdered by one of his satraps the next year. On went Alexander, pursuing the Iranians of the northeast into Afghanistan, where Kandahar is another of the many cities which commemorate his name, and penetrating 100 miles or so beyond the Indus into the Punjab. Then he turned back because his army would go no further. It was tired, and having defeated an army with 200 elephants may have been disinclined to face the further 5,000 reported to be waiting for it in the Ganges Valley. Alexander returned to Babylon. There he died in 323 BC, 32 years old and just over 10 years after he had left Macedon. Both his conquests and their organization in empire bear the stamp of individual genius. The word is not too strong, for achievement on this scale is more than the fruit of good fortune, favorable historical circumstance, or blind determinism. Alexander was a creative mind and something of a visionary, even if self-absorbed and obsessed with his pursuit of glory. With great intelligence he combined almost reckless courage. He believed his mother's ancestor to be Homer's Achilles and strove to emulate the hero. He was ambitious as much to prove himself in men's eyes, or perhaps those of his forceful and repellent mother, as to win new lands. The idea of the Hellenic crusade against Persia undoubtedly had reality for him, but he was also, for all his admiration of the Greek culture of which he had learnt from his tutor Aristotle, too egocentric to be a missionary, and his cosmopolitanism was grounded in an appreciation of realities. His empire had to be run by Persians as well as Macedonians. Alexander himself married first a Bactrian and then a Persian princess, and accepted, unfittingly, thought some of his companions, the homage which the East rendered to rulers it thought to be godlike. He was also at times rash and impulsive. It was his soldiers who finally made him turn back at the Indus, and the ruler of Macedon had no business plunging into battle with no attention for what would happen to the monarchy if he should die without a successor. Worse still, he killed a friend in a drunken brawl, and he may have arranged his father's murder. Alexander lived too short a time either to ensure the unity of his empire in the future or to prove to posterity that even he could not have held it together for long. What he did in this time is indubitably impressive. The foundation of 25 cities is by itself a considerable matter, even if some of them were only spruced-up strongholds. They were keys to the Asian land routes. The integration of East and West in their government was still more difficult, but Alexander took it a long way in 10 years. Of course, he had little choice. There were not enough Greeks and Macedonians to conquer and govern the huge empire. From the first he ruled through Persian officials in the conquered areas, and after coming back from India he began the reorganization of the army into mixed regiments of Macedonians and Persians. His adoption of Persian dress and his attempt to exact prostration from his compatriots as well as from Persians antagonized his followers, for they revealed his taste for Oriental manners. There were plots and mutinies. They were not successful, and his relatively mild reprisals do not suggest that the situation was ever very dangerous for Alexander. The crisis was followed by his most spectacular gesture of cultural integration when, taking Darius's daughter as a wife, in addition to his Bactrian princess, Roxana, he then officiated at the mass wedding of 9,000 of his soldiers to Eastern women. This was the famous marriage of East and West, an act of state rather than of idealism, for the new empire had to be cemented together if it was to survive. What the empire really meant in cultural interplay is more difficult to assess. There was certainly a wider physical dispersal of Greeks. But the results of this were only to appear after Alexander's death, when the formal framework of empire collapsed and yet the cultural fact of a Hellenistic world emerged from it. We do not in fact know very much about life in Alexander's empire, and it must be unlikely, given its brief duration, the limitations of ancient government and a lack of will to embark upon fundamental change, that most of its inhabitants found things very different in 323 BC from what they had known 10 years before. Alexander's impact was made in the East. He did not reign long enough to affect the interplay of the Western Greeks with Carthage, which was the main preoccupation of the later 4th century BC in the West. In Greece itself things stayed quiet until his death. It was in Asia that he ruled lands no Greeks had ruled before. In Persia he had proclaimed himself heir to the great king, and rulers in the northern satrapies of Bithynia, Cappadocia and Armenia did him homage. Weak as the cement of the Alexandrine Empire must have been, it was subjected to intolerable strain when he died without a competent heir. His generals fell to fighting for what they could get and keep, and the empire was dissolving even before the birth of his posthumous son by Roxana. She had already murdered his second wife, so when she and her son died in the Troubles any hope of direct descent vanished. In 40-odd years of fighting it was settled that there would be no reconstitution of Alexander's empire. There emerged instead a group of big states, each of them a hereditary monarchy. They were founded by successful soldiers, the Diadochi, or successors. Ptolemy Soter, one of Alexander's best generals, had at once seized power in Egypt on his master's death, and to it he subsequently conveyed the valuable prize of Alexander's body. Ptolemy's descendants were to rule the province for nearly 300 years until the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. Ptolemaic Egypt was the longest-lived and richest of the successor states. Of the Asian Empire, the Indian territories and some of Afghanistan passed out of Greek hands altogether, being ceded to an Indian ruler in return for military help. The rest of it was by 300 BC a huge kingdom of 1.5 million square miles and perhaps 30 million subjects, stretching from Afghanistan to Syria, the site of its capital, Ansh. This vast domain was ruled by the descendants of Syracuse, another Macedonian general. Attacks by migrating Celts from northern Europe, who had already invaded Macedonia itself, led to its partial disruption early in the 3rd century BC. And part of it thenceforth formed the kingdom of Pergamon, ruled by a dynasty called the Attalids who pushed the Celts further into Asia Minor. The Seleucids kept the rest, though they were to lose Bactria in 225 BC, where descendants of Alexander's soldiers set up a remarkable Greek kingdom. Macedon, under another dynasty, the Antigonids, strove to retain a control of the Greek states contested in the Aegean by the Ptolemaic fleet and in Asia Minor by the Seleucids. Once again, in about 265 BC, Athens made a bid for independence but failed. These events are complicated, but not very important for our purpose. What mattered more was that for about 60 years after 280 BC the Hellenistic kingdoms lived in a rough balance of power, preoccupied with events in the eastern Mediterranean and Asia and, except for the Greeks and Macedonians, paying little attention to events further west. This provided a peaceful setting for the greatest extension of Greek culture, and this is why these states are important. It is their contribution to the diffusion and growth of a civilization that constitute their claim on our attention, not the obscure politics and unrewarding struggles of the Diadochi. Greek was now the official language of the whole Middle East. Even more importantly, it was the language of the cities, the foci of the New World. Under the Seleucids, the union of Hellenistic and Oriental civilization to which Alexander may have aspired began to be a reality. They urgently sought Greek immigrants and founded new cities wherever they could as a means of providing some solid framework for their empire and of Hellenizing the local population. The cities were the substance of Seleucid power, for beyond them stretched a heterogeneous hinterland of tribes, Persian satrapies and vassal princes. Seleucid administration was still based fundamentally upon the satrapies. The theory of absolutism was inherited by the Seleucid kings from the Achaemenids just as was their system of taxation. The growth of cities reflected economic growth as well as conscious policy. The wars of Alexander and his successors released an enormous booty, much of it in bullion, accumulated by the Persian Empire. It stimulated economic life all over the Middle East, but also brought the evils of inflation and instability. Nevertheless, the overall trend was towards greater wealth. There were no great innovations either in manufacture or in the tapping of new natural resources. The Mediterranean economy remained much what it had always been except in scale, but Hellenistic civilization was richer than its predecessors and population growth was one sign of this. Its wealth sustained governments of some magnificence, raising large revenues and spending them in spectacular and sometimes commendable ways. The ruins of the Hellenistic cities show expenditure on the appurtenances of Greek urban life. Theatres and gymnasia abound, games and festivals were held in all of them. This probably did not much affect the native populations of the countryside who paid the taxes, and some of them resented what would now be called westernization. Nonetheless, it was a solid achievement. Through the cities the Middle East was Hellenized in a way which was to mark it until the coming of Islam. Soon they produced their own Greek literature. Yet though this was a civilization of Greek cities, in spirit it was unlike that of the past, as some Greeks noted sourly. The Macedonians had never known the life of the city-state and their creations in Asia lacked its vigor. The Seleucids founded scores of cities but maintained the old autocratic and centralized administration of the satrapies above that level. Bureaucracy was highly developed and self-government languished. Ironically, besides having to bear the burden of disaster in the past, the cities of Greece itself, where a flickering tradition of independence lived on, were the one part of the Hellenistic world that actually underwent economic and demographic decline. Though the political nerve had gone, city culture still served as a great transmission system for Greek ideas. Large endowments provided at Alexandria and Pergamon the two greatest libraries of the ancient world. Ptolemy I also founded the museum, a kind of institute of advanced study. In Pergamon a king endowed schoolmasterships, and it was there that people perfected the use of parchment, pergamene. When the Ptolemies cut off supplies of papyrus. In Athens the academy and the lyceum survived, and from such sources the tradition of Greek intellectual activity was everywhere refreshed. Much of this activity was academic in the narrow sense that it was in essence commentary on past achievement, but much of it was also of high quality and now seems lacking in weight only because of the gigantic achievements of the 5th and 4th centuries. It was a tradition solid enough to endure right through the Christian era, though much of its content has been irretrievably lost. Eventually, the world of Islam would receive the teaching of Plato and Aristotle through what had been passed on by Hellenistic scholars. Hellenistic civilization preserved the Greek tradition most successfully in science, and here Alexandria, the greatest of all Hellenistic cities, was preeminent. Euclid was the greatest systematizer of geometry, defining it until the 19th century, and Archimedes, famous for his practical achievements in the construction of war machines in Sicily, was probably Euclid's pupil. Another Alexandrian, Eratosthenes, was the first man to measure the size of the earth, and a Hellenistic Greek, Aristarchus of Samos, got so far as to say that the earth moved around the sun, though his views were set aside by contemporaries and posterity because they could not be squared with Aristotelian physics, which stated the contrary. In hydrostatics, Archimedes made great strides, and invented the windlass, too, but the central achievement of the Greek tradition was always mathematical, not practical, and in Hellenistic times it reached its apogee with the theory of conic sections and ellipses and the founding of trigonometry. These were important additions to humanity's toolkit. Yet they were less distinct from what went before than was Hellenistic moral and political philosophy. It is tempting to find the reason for this in the political change from the city-state to larger units. It was still in Athens that the philosophy of the age found its greatest center, and Aristotle had hoped to reinvigorate the city-state. In the right hands, he thought, it could still provide the framework for the good life. But perhaps because of the need to impress non-Greeks, perhaps because they felt the positive attraction of the world beyond Greek culture, the new monarchs buttressed themselves more and more with Oriental cults attached to the person of the ruler, whose origins went back into the Mesopotamian and Egyptian past. Meanwhile, the real basis of the Hellenistic states was bureaucracy unchecked by traditions of civic independence. Since the Seleucids had founded or refounded most of the Greek cities in Asia, what they had given they could take back, and armies of Greek and Macedonian mercenaries which relieved them of dependence on native troops. Powerful and awe-inspiring though they might be, there was little in such structures to capture their very mixed subjects' loyalties and emotions. Some of the Hellenistic triumph of Greek culture was deceptive. Language went on being used, but with a different meaning. Greek religion, for example, a great force for unity among Hellenes, was in decline, as was the rationalism of the 5th century. This collapse of a traditional framework of values was the background to philosophical change. The study of philosophy was still vigorous in Greece itself, and even there its Hellenistic development suggests that men were falling back upon personal concerns, contracting out of societies they could not influence, seeking shelter from the buffet of fate and the strain of daily life. It seems somewhat familiar. One example was Epicurus, who sought the good in an essentially private experience of pleasure. Contrary to later misinterpretations, he meant by this something far from self-indulgence. For Epicurus, pleasure was psychological contentment and the absence of pain, a view of pleasure somewhat austere to modern eyes. But symptomatically its importance is considerable because it reveals a shift in men's preoccupations towards the private and personal. Another form of this philosophic reaction advocated the ideals of renunciation and non-attachment. The school, known as the Cynics, expressed contempt for convention and sought release from dependence on the material world. One of them, Zeno, a Cypriot, who lived at Athens, began to teach a doctrine of his own in a public place, the Stoapoikao or painted portico. The place gave its name to those he taught, the Stoics. They were to be among the most influential of philosophers because their teaching was readily applicable to daily life. Essentially, the Stoics taught that life should be lived to fit the rational order they discerned running through the universe. Man could not control what happened to him, they said, but he could accept what was sent by fate, the decree of the divine will in which they believed. Virtuous acts, accordingly, should not be performed for their likely consequences, which might well be unfortunate or thwarted, but for their own sake, because of their intrinsic value. In Stoicism, which was to have great success in the Hellenistic world, lay a doctrine which gave the individual a new ground for ethical confidence at a time when neither polis nor traditional Greek religion retained its authority. Stoicism also had the potential for a long life, because it applied to all men, who, it taught, were all alike. This was the seed of an ethical universalism which gradually transcended the old distinction between Greek and barbarian, as it would any other distinction between reasonable men. It spoke to a common humanity and actually produced a condemnation of slavery, an amazing step in a world built by forced labor. It was to be a fecund source for thinkers for 2,000 years. Soon its ethic of disciplined common sense was to have great success at Rome. Philosophy thus showed the symptoms of the eclecticism and cosmopolitanism which strike the eye in almost every other aspect of Hellenistic culture. Perhaps their most obvious expression was the adaptation of Greek sculpture to the monumental statuary of the East, which produced such monsters as the 100-foot-high Colossus of Rhodes. Yet in the end eclecticism and cosmopolitanism appeared everywhere, in the aspirations of the Stoics just as in the exotic Oriental cults which displaced the Greek gods. It was the scientist Eratosthenes who said that he saw all good men as fellow countrymen, and the remark expresses the new spirit which was Hellenism at its best. The political framework of this world was bound in the end to change, because sources of change grew up beyond its circumference. One early omen was the appearance of a new threat in the east, the kingdom of Parthia. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, the weakness imposed by the Seleucid kingdom's concentration of population and wealth in its western half was leading to its overpreoccupation with relations with the other Hellenistic states. The northeast was threatened, as always, by nomads from the steppes, but government was distracted from this danger by the need to supply money and resources for quarrels with Ptolemaic Egypt. The temptation for a remote satrap to strike out on his own as a warlord was often irresistible. Scholars contest the details, but one of the satrapies in which this happened was Parthia, an important area to the southeast of the Caspian. It was to become more important still as the centuries passed, for it lay across the caravan routes to Central Eurasia by which the Western classical world and China came to be remotely in touch, the Silk Road. Who are the Parthians? They were originally an Iranian nomadic people who emerged from Central Eurasia to create and recreate a political unity in the highlands of Iran and Mesopotamia. They became a byword for a military skill then peculiar to them, the discharging of arrows by mounted horsemen. They did not build nearly 500 years of political continuity only on this, though. They also inherited an administrative structure left to the Seleucids by Alexander, who had taken it from the Persians. Indeed, in most things the Parthians seemed inheritors, not originators. Their great dynasty used Greek for its official documents, and they seem to have had no law of their own but to have readily accepted existing practice, whether Babylonian, Persian or Hellenistic. Much about their early history remains obscure. There was a kingdom, whose center remains undiscovered, in Parthia in the 3rd century BC, but the Seleucids do not seem to have reacted strongly to it. In the 2nd century, when the Seleucid monarchy was much more disastrously engaged in the west, two brothers, the younger of whom was Mithridates I, established a Parthian empire, which at his death stretched from Bactria, another fragment of the Seleucid inheritance which had been finally separated from it at about the same time as Parthia, in the east, to Babylonia in the west. Consciously reminiscent of those who had gone before, Mithridates described himself on his coins as the Great King. There were setbacks after his death, but his namesake Mithridates too recovered lost ground and went even further. The Seleucids were now confined to Syria. In Mesopotamia the frontier of his empire was the Euphrates, and the Chinese opened diplomatic relations with him. The coins of the second Mithridates bore the proud Achaemenid title, King of Kings, and the inference is reasonable that the Arsacid dynasty to which Mithridates belonged was now being consciously related to the great Persian line. Yet the Parthian state seems a much looser thing than the Persian. It is more reminiscent of a feudal grouping of nobles about a warlord than a bureaucratized state. On the Euphrates, Parthia was eventually to meet a new power from the west. Less remote from it than Parthia, and therefore with less excuse, even the Hellenistic kingdoms had been almost oblivious to the rise of Rome, this new star of the political firmament, and went their way almost without regard for what was happening in the west. The Western Greeks, of course, knew more about it, but they long remained preoccupied with the first great threat they had faced, Carthage, a rival to the Greeks in the Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenicians somewhere around 800 BC, perhaps even then to offset Greek commercial competition on the metal routes, Carthage had grown to surpass Tyre and Sidon in wealth and power. But she remained a city-state, using alliances and protection rather than conquests and garrisons, her citizens preferring trade and agriculture to fighting. Unfortunately, the native documentation of Carthage was to perish when, finally, the city was razed to the ground in 146 BC. And we know little of its own history. Yet it was clearly a formidable commercial competitor for the Western Greeks. By 480 BC they had been confined commercially to little more than the Rhone Valley, Italy and, above all, Sicily. This island, and one of its cities, Syracuse, was the key to the Greek West. Syracuse protected Sicily from the Carthaginians for the first time when she fought and beat them in the year of Salamis. For most of the 5th century Carthage troubled the Western Greeks no more, and the Syracusans were able to turn to supporting the Greek cities of Italy against the Etruscans. Then Syracuse was the target of the ill-fated Sicilian expedition from Athens, 415 to 413 BC. Because she was the greatest of the Western Greek states. The Carthaginians came back after this, but Syracuse survived defeat to enjoy soon afterwards her greatest period of power, exercised not only in the island, but in southern Italy and the Adriatic. During most of it she was at war with Carthage. There was plenty of vigor in Syracuse. At one moment she all but captured Carthage and another expedition added Corcyra, Corfu, to her Adriatic possessions. But soon after 300 BC it was clear that Carthaginian power was growing while Syracuse had also to face a Roman threat in mainland Italy. The Sicilians fell out with a man who might have saved them, Pyrrhus of Epirus, and by the mid-3rd century the Romans were masters of the mainland. There were now 3 major actors in the Western arena, yet the Hellenistic East seemed strangely uninterested in what was going on, though Pyrrhus was aware of it. This was perhaps short-sighted, but at this time the Romans did not see themselves as world conquerors. They were as much moved by fear as by greed in entering on the Punic Wars with Carthage, from which they would emerge victors. Then they would turn east. Some Hellenistic Greeks were beginning to be aware by the end of the century of what might be coming. A cloud in the west was one description of the struggle between Carthage and Rome viewed from the Hellenized east. Whatever its outcome, it was bound to have great repercussions for the whole Mediterranean. Nonetheless, the East was to prove in the event that it had its own strengths and powers of resistance. As one Roman later put it, Greece would take her captors captive, Hellenizing yet more barbarians.